there, everyone. Today the Bookworms are going to be reading Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, written by Roald Dahl. Chapter 10. Transport Capsule in Trouble. Attack Number 1. While Shuckworth, Shanks, and Showler were being chased out of the space hotel by the Nids, Mr. Wonka's great glass elevator was orbiting the Earth at tremendous speed. Mr. Wonka had all his booster rockets firing and the elevator was reaching speeds of 34,000 miles an hour instead of the normal 17,000. They were trying, you see, to get away from that huge, angry, vermicious Nid with a purple behind. Mr. Wonka wasn't afraid of it, but Grandma Josephine was petrified. Every time she looked at it, she let out a piercing scream and clapped her hands over her eyes. But of course, 34,000 miles an hour is dawdling to a Nid. Healthy young Nids think nothing of traveling 1,000,000 miles between lunch and supper, and then another 1,000,000 before breakfast the next day. How else could they travel between the planet Worms and other stars? Mr. Wonka should have known this and saved his rocket power, but he kept right on going, and the giant Nid kept right on cruising effortlessly alongside, glaring into the elevator with its wicked red eye. "You people have bruised my backside," the Nid seemed to be saying, "and in the end, I'm going to get you for that." They had been streaking around the Earth like this for about 45 minutes when Charlie, who was floating comfortably beside Grandpa Joe near the ceiling, said suddenly, "There's something ahead. Can you see it, Grandpa? Straight in front of us." "I can, Charlie, I can." "Good heavens, it's the Space Hotel." "It can't be, Grandpa. We left it miles behind us long ago." "Aha," said Mr. Wonka. "We've been going so fast we've gone all the way around the Earth and caught up with it again. A splendid effort." "And there's the transport capsule. Can you see it, Grandpa? It's just behind the Space Hotel." "There's something else there too, Charlie, if I'm not mistaken." "I know what those are," screamed Grandma Josephine. "They're vermicious Nids! Turn back at once!" "Reverse!" yelled Grandma Georgina. "Go the other way!" "Dear lady," said Mr. Wonka, "this isn't a car on the motorway. When you are in orbit, you cannot stop and you cannot go backwards." "I don't care about that!" shouted Grandma Josephine. "Put on the brakes! Stop! Backpedal! The Nids'll get us!" "Now let's, for heaven's sake, stop this nonsense once and for all," Mr. Wonka said sternly. "You know very well my elevator is completely Nid-proof. You have nothing to fear." They were closer now, and they could see the Nids pouring out from the tail of the Space Hotel and swarming like wasps around the transport capsule. "They're attacking it," said Charlie. "They're after the transport capsule." It was a fearsome sight. The huge green egg-shaped Nids were grouping themselves into squadrons, with about 20 Nids to a squadron. Then each squadron formed itself into a line abreast, with 1 yard between Nids. Then, one after another, the squadrons began attacking the transport capsule. They attacked in reverse, with their pointed rear ends in front, and they came in at a fantastic speed. Wham! One squadron attacked, bounced off, and wheeled away. Crash! Another squadron smashed against the side of the transport capsule. "Get us out of here, you madman!" screamed Grandma Josephine. "What are you waiting for?" "They'll be coming after us next," yelled Grandma Georgina. "For heaven's sake, man, turn back!" "I doubt very much if that capsule of theirs is Nid-proof," said Mr. Wonka. "Then we must help them," cried Charlie. "We've got to do something. There are 150 people inside that thing." Down on the Earth in the White House study, the president and his advisors were listening in horror to the voices of the astronauts over the radio. "They're coming at us in droves!" Shuckworth was shouting. "They're bashing us to bits!" "But who?" yelled the president. "You haven't even told us who's attacking you." "These dirty, great, greenish-brown brutes with red eyes," shouted Shanks, butting in. "They're shaped like enormous eggs, and they're coming at us backwards." "Backwards?" cried the president. "Why backwards?" "Because their bottoms are even more pointy than their tops," shouted Shuckworth. "Look out!" Here comes another lot! Bang! We won't be able to stand this much longer, Mr. President. The waitresses are screaming and the chambermaids are all hysterical and the bellboys are being sick and the hall porters are saying their prayers. So what shall we do, Mr. President, sir? What on earth shall we do? Fire your rockets, you idiot, and make a re-entry, shouted the president. Come back to Earth immediately. That's impossible, cried Showler. They've busted our rockets. They've smashed them into smithereens. We're cooked, Mr. President, shouted Shanks. We're done for, because even if they don't succeed in destroying the capsule, we'll have to stay up here in orbit for the rest of our lives. We can't make a re-entry without rockets. The president was sweating and the sweat ran all the way down the back of his neck and inside his collar. Any moment now, Mr. President, Shanks went on, we're going to lose contact with you altogether. There's another lot coming at us from the left, and they're aiming straight for our radio aerial. Here they come! I don't think we'll be able to. The voice cut. The radio went dead. Shanks! Cried the president. Where are you, Shanks? Shuckworth? Shanks? Showler? Showleworth? Shucks? Shankler? Shankworth? Show? Shuckler? Why don't you answer me? Up in the great glass elevator, where they had no radio and could hear nothing of these conversations, Charlie was saying, Surely their only hope is to make a re-entry and dive back to Earth quickly. Yes, said Mr. Wonka, but in order to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, they've got to kick themselves out of orbit. They've got to change course and head downwards, and to do that, they need rockets. But their rocket tubes are all dented and bent. You can see that from here. They're crippled. Why can't we tow them down? Charlie asked. Mr. Wonka jumped. Even though he was floating, he somehow jumped. He was so excited he shot upwards and hit his head on the ceiling. Then he spun round 3 times in the air and cried, Charlie! You've got it! That's it! We'll tow them out of orbit! To the buttons, quick! What do we tow them with? Asked Grandpa Joe. Our neckties? Don't you worry about a little thing like that, cried Mr. Wonka. My great glass elevator is ready for anything. In we go. Into the breach, dear friends, into the breach. Stop him, screamed Grandma Josephine. You be quiet, Josie, said Grandpa Joe. There's someone over there needs a helping hand, and it's our job to give it. If you're frightened, you'd better just close your eyes tight and stick your fingers in your ears. Chapter 11. The Battle of the Nids. Grandpa Joe, sir, shouted Mr. Wonka. Kindly jet yourself over to the far corner of the elevator there, and turn that handle. It lowers the rope. A rope's no good, Mr. Wonka. The Nids will bite through a rope in 1 second. It's a steel rope, said Mr. Wonka. It's made of re-scorched steel. If they try to bite through that, their teeth will splinter like spilikins. To your buttons, Charlie. You've got to help me maneuver. We're going right over the top of the transport capsule, and then we'll try to hook onto it somewhere and get a firm hold. Like a battleship going into action, the great glass elevator with booster rockets firing moved smoothly in over the top of the enormous transport capsule. The Nids immediately stopped attacking the capsule and went for the elevator. Squadron after squadron of giant vermicious Nids flung themselves fiercely against Mr. Wonka's marvelous machine. Wham! Crash! Bang! The noise was thunderous and terrible. The elevator was tossed about the sky like a leaf, and inside it, Grandma Josephine, Grandma Georgina, and Grandpa George, floating in their nightshirts, were all yowling and screeching and flapping their arms and calling for help. Mrs. Bucket had wrapped her arms around Mr. Bucket and was clasping him so tightly that one of his shirt buttons punctured his skin. Charlie and Mr. Wonka, as cool as 2 cubes of ice, were up near the ceiling working the booster rocket controls. And Grandpa Joe, shouting war cries and throwing curses at the Nids, was down below turning the handle that unwound the steel rope. At the same time, he was watching the rope through the glass floor of the elevator. Starboard a bit, Charlie, shouted Grandpa Joe. We're right on top of her now. Forward a couple of yards, Mr. Wonka. I'm trying to get the hook hooked around that stumpy thing sticking out in front there. Hold it! I've got it! That's it! Forward a little now and see if it holds. More, more. The big steel rope tightened. It held! And now, wonder of wonders, with her booster rockets blazing, the elevator began to tow the huge transport capsule forward and away. Full speed ahead, shouted Grandpa Joe. She's going to hold! She's holding! She's holding fine! All boosters firing, cried Mr. Wonka, and the elevator leaped ahead. Still the rope held. Mr. Wonka jetted himself down to Grandpa Joe and shook him warmly by the hand. Well done, sir, he said. You did a brilliant job under heavy fire. Charlie looked back at the transport capsule some 30 yards behind them, on the end of the tow line. It had little windows up front, and in the windows he could clearly see the flabbergasted faces of Shuckworth, Shanks, and Showler. Charlie waved to them and gave them the thumbs-up signal. They didn't wave back. They simply gaped. They couldn't believe what was happening. Grandpa Joe blew himself upward and hovered beside Charlie, bubbling with excitement. Charlie, my boy, he said, we've been through a few funny things together lately, but never anything like this. Grandpa, where are the Nids? They've suddenly vanished. Everyone looked around. The only Nid in sight was their old friend with the purple behind, still cruising alongside in its usual place, still glaring into the elevator. Just a minute, cried Grandma Josephine. What's that I see over there? Again they looked, and this time, sure enough, away in the distance, in the deep blue sky of outer space, they saw a massive cloud of vermicious Nids wheeling and circling like a fleet of bombers. If you think we're out of the woods yet, you're crazy, shouted Grandma Georgina. I fear no Nids, said Mr. Wonka. We've got them beaten now. Pop your rod and pig wash, said Grandma Josephine. Any moment now they'll be at us again. Look at them. They're coming in. They're coming closer. This was true. The huge fleet of Nids had moved in at incredible speed and was now flying level with the great glass elevator, a couple of 100 yards away on the right-hand side. The one with the bump on its rear end was much closer, only 20 yards away on the same side. It's changing shape, cried Charlie. The nearest one! What's it going to do? It's getting longer and longer. And indeed it was. The mammoth egg-shaped body was slowly stretching itself out like a chewing gum, becoming longer and longer and thinner, until in the end it looked exactly like a long, slimy green serpent, as thick as a thick tree and as long as a football pitch. At the front end were the eyes, big and white with red centers. At the back, a kind of tapering tail, and at the very end of the tail was the enormous round swollen bump it had got when it crashed against the glass. The people floating inside the elevator watched and waited. Then they saw the long rope-like Nid turning and coming straight but quite slowly toward the great glass elevator. Now it began actually wrapping its ropey body around the elevator itself. Once around it went, then twice around. And very horrifying it was to be inside and to see the soft green body squishing against the outside of the glass no more than a few inches away. It's tying us up like a parcel, yelled Grandma Josephine. Bunkum, said Mr. Wonka. It's going to crush us in its coils, wailed Grandma Georgina. Never, said Mr. Wonka. Charlie glanced quickly back at the transport capsule. The sheet white faces of Shuckworth, Shanks, and Showler were pressed against the glass of the little windows, terror-struck, stupefied, stunned, their mouths open, their expressions frozen like fish fingers. Once again, Charlie gave them the thumbs-up signal. Showler acknowledged it with a sickly grin, but that was all. Oh, 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 screamed Grandma Josephine. Get that beastly, squishy thing away from here! Having curled its body twice around the elevator, the Nid now proceeded to tie a knot with its two ends. A good strong knot, left over right, then right over left. When it had pulled the knot tight, there remained about 5 yards of one end hanging loose. This was the end with the eyes on it, but it didn't hang loose for long. It quickly curled itself into the shape of a huge hook, and the hook stuck straight out sideways from the elevator, as though waiting for something else to hook itself onto it. While all this was going on, nobody had noticed what the other Nids were up to. "Mr. Wonka!" Charlie cried. "Look at the others! What are they doing?" What indeed? These two had all changed shape and had become longer, but not nearly so long or so thin as the first one. Each of them had turned itself into a kind of thick rod, and the rod was curled around at both ends, at the tail end and at the head end, so that it made a double-ended hook. And now all the hooks were linking up into one long chain. 1,000 Nids, all joining together and curving around in the sky to make a chain of Nids half a mile long or more. And the Nid at the very front of the chain, whose front hook was not, of course, hooked up to anything, was leading them in a wide circle and sweeping in toward the great glass elevator. "Hey!" shouted Grandpa Joe. "They're going to hook up with this brute who's tied himself around us." "And tow us away!" cried Charlie. "To the planet Worms!" gasped Grandma Josephine. 18,427 million miles from here." "They can't do that," cried Mr. Wonka. "We're doing the towing around here." "They're going to link up, Mr. Wonka," Charlie said. "They really are. Can't we stop them? They're going to tow us away, and they're going to tow the people we're towing away as well." "Do something, you old fool," shrieked Grandma Georgina. "Don't just float about looking at them." "I must admit," said Mr. Wonka, "that for the first time in my life I find myself at a bit of a loss." They all stared in horror through the glass at the long chain of vermicious Nids. The leader of the chain was coming closer and closer. The hook with two big, angry eyes on it was out and ready. In 30 seconds, it would link up with the hook of the Nid wrapped around the elevator. "I want to go home," wailed Grandma Josephine. "Why can't we all go home?" "Great thundering tomcats!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Home is right! What on earth am I thinking of? Come on, Charlie, quick! Re-entry! You take the yellow button. Press it for all you're worth. I'll handle this lot." Charlie and Mr. Wonka literally flew to the buttons. "Hold your hats!" shouted Mr. Wonka. "Grab your gizzards. We're going down." Rockets started firing out of the elevator from all sides. It tilted and gave a sickening lurch, and then plunged downward into the Earth's atmosphere at a simply colossal speed. "Retro rockets!" bellowed Mr. Wonka. "I mustn't forget to fire the retro rockets." He flew over to another series of buttons and started playing on them like a piano. The elevator was now streaking downward head first, upside down, and all the passengers found themselves floating upside down as well. "Help!" screamed Grandma Georgina. "All the blood's going to my head." "Then turn yourself the other way up," said Mr. Wonka. "That's easy enough, isn't it?" Everyone blew and puffed and turned somersaults in the air until, at last, they were all the right way up. "How's the tow rope holding, Grandpa?" Mr. Wonka called out. "They're still with us, Mr. Wonka, sir. The rope's holding fine." It was an amazing sight. The glass elevator streaking down toward the earth, with a huge transport capsule in tow behind it. But the long chain of Nids was coming after them, following them down, keeping pace with them easily. And now the hook of the leading Nid in the chain was actually reaching out and grasping for the hook made by the Nid on the elevator. "We're too late!" screamed Grandma Georgina. "They're going to link up and haul us back." "I think not," said Mr. Wonka. "Don't you remember what happens when a Nid enters the Earth's atmosphere at high speed? He gets red hot. He burns away in a long fiery trail. He becomes a shooting Nid. Soon these dirty beasts will start popping like popcorn." As they streaked on downward, sparks began to fly off the sides of the elevator. The glass glowed pink, then red, then scarlet. Sparks also began to fly on the long chain of Nids, and the leading Nid in the chain started to shine like a red-hot poker. So did all the others. So did the great slimy brood coiled around the elevator itself. This one, in fact, was trying frantically to uncoil itself and get away, but it was having trouble untying the knot. In another 10 seconds, it began to sizzle. Inside the elevator, they could actually hear it sizzling. It made a noise like bacon frying. And exactly the same sort of thing was happening to the other 1,000 Nids in the chain. The tremendous heat was simply sizzling them up. They were red hot, every one of them. Then suddenly, they became white hot, and they gave out a dazzling white light. "They're shooting Nids!" cried Charlie. "What a splendid sight!" said Mr. Wonka. "It's better than fireworks." In a few seconds more, the Nids had blown away in a cloud of ashes, and it was all over. "We've done it!" cried Mr. Wonka. "They've been roasted to a crisp. They've been frizzled to a fritter. We're saved!" "What do you mean, saved?" said Grandma Josephine. "We'll all be frizzled ourselves if this goes on any longer. We'll be barbecued like beefsteaks. Look at that glass! It's hotter than a fizz-cake." "Have no fears, dear lady," answered Mr. Wonka. "My elevator is air-conditioned, ventilated, aerated, and automated in every possible way. We're going to be all right now." "I haven't the faintest idea what's been going on," said Mrs. Bucket, making one of her rare speeches. "But whatever it is, I don't like it." "Aren't you enjoying it, Mother?" Charlie asked her. "No," she said, "I'm not, nor is your father." "What a great sight it is," said Mr. Wonka. "Just look at the Earth down there, Charlie, getting bigger and bigger." "And us going to meet it at 2,000 miles an hour, groaned Grandma Georgina. "How are you going to slow down, for heaven's sake? You didn't think of that, did you?" "He's got parachutes," Charlie told her. "I'll bet he's got great big parachutes that open just before we hit." "Parachutes?" said Mr. Wonka with contempt. "Parachutes are only for astronauts and sissies. And anyway, we don't want to slow down. We want to speed up. I've told you already, we've got to be going at an absolutely tremendous speed when we hit. Otherwise, we'll never punch our way in through the roof of the chocolate factory." "How about the transport capsule?" Charlie asked anxiously. "We'll be letting them go in a few seconds now," Mr. Wonka answered. "They do have parachutes, 3 of them, to slow them down on the last bit." "How do you know we won't land in the Pacific Ocean?" said Grandma Josephine. "I don't," said Mr. Wonka. "But we all know how to swim, do we not?" "This man," shouted Grandma Josephine, "is crazy as a crumpet." "He's cracked as a crayfish," cried Grandma Georgina. Down and down plunged the great glass elevator. Nearer and nearer came the earth below. Oceans and continents rushed up to meet them, getting bigger every second. "Grandpa Joe, sir, throw out the rope. Let it go," ordered Mr. Wonka. "They'll be all right now so long as their parachutes are working." "Rope gone," called out Grandpa Joe, and the huge transport capsule, on its own now, began to swing away to one side. Charlie waved to the 3 astronauts in the front window. None of them waved back. They were still sitting there in a kind of shocked daze, gaping at the old ladies and the old men and the small boy floating about in the glass elevator. "It won't be long now," said Mr. Wonka, reaching for a row of tiny pale blue buttons in one corner. "We shall soon know whether we are alive or dead. Keep very quiet, please, for this final bit. I have to concentrate awfully hard. Otherwise, we'll come down in the wrong place." They plunged into a thick bank of cloud, and for 10 seconds they could see nothing. When they came out of the cloud, the transport capsule had disappeared, and the earth was very close, and there was only a great spread of land beneath them with mountains and forests, then fields and trees, then a small town. "There it is!" shouted Mr. Wonka. "My chocolate factory! My beloved chocolate factory!" "You mean Charlie's chocolate factory," said Grandpa Joe. "That's right," said Mr. Wonka, addressing Charlie. "I'd clean forgotten. I do apologize to you, my dear boy. Of course it's yours. And here we go!" Through the glass floor of the elevator, Charlie caught a quick glimpse of the huge red roof and the tall chimneys of the giant factory. They were plunging straight down to it. "Hold your breath!" shouted Mr. Wonka. "Hold your nose! Fasten your seatbelts and say your prayers! We're going through the roof!" Chapter 12. Back to the Chocolate Factory. And then the noise of splintering wood and broken glass, and absolute darkness, and the most awful crunching sounds as the elevator rushed on and on, smashing everything before it. All at once, the crashing noises stopped and the ride became smoother, and the elevator seemed to be traveling on guides or rails, twisting and turning like a roller coaster. And when the lights came on, Charlie suddenly realized that for the last few seconds, he hadn't been floating at all. He had been standing normally on the floor. Mr. Wonka was on the floor too, and so was Grandpa Joe and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, and also the big bed. As for Grandma Josephine, Grandma Georgina, and Grandpa George, they must have fallen right back onto the bed, because they were now all three on top of it and scrabbling to get under the blanket. "We're through!" yelled Mr. Wonka. "We've done it! We're in!" Grandpa Joe grabbed him by the hand and said, "Well done, sir! How splendid! What a magnificent job!" "Where in the world are we now?" said Mrs. Bucket. "We're back, Mother!" cried Charlie. "We're in the chocolate factory!" "I'm very glad to hear it," said Mrs. Bucket. "But didn't we come rather a long way round?" "We had to," said Mr. Wonka, "to avoid the traffic." "I have never met a man," said Grandma Georgina, "who talks so much absolute nonsense." "A little nonsense now and then is relished by the wisest man," Mr. Wonka said. "Why don't you pay some attention to where this crazy elevator's going?" shouted Grandma Josephine, "and stop foodling about." "A little foodling roundabout will stop you going up the spout," said Mr. Wonka. "What did I tell you?" cried Grandma Georgina. "He's round the twist. He's bobbed as a beetle. He's dotty as a dingbat. He's got rats in the roof. I want to go home." "Too late," said Mr. Wonka. "We're there." The elevator stopped. The doors opened and Charlie found himself looking out once again at the great chocolate room, with the chocolate river and the chocolate waterfall, where everything was eatable. The trees, the leaves, the grass, the pebbles, and even the rocks. And there to meet them were hundreds and hundreds of tiny Oompa Loompas, all waving and cheering. It was a sight that took one's breath away. Even Grandma Georgina was stunned into silence for a few seconds, but not for long. "Who in the world are all those peculiar little men?" she said. "They're Oompa Loompas," Charlie told her. "They're wonderful. You'll love them." "Shh," said Grandpa Joe. "Listen, Charlie, the drums are starting up. They're going to sing." "Alleluia," sang the Oompa Loompas. "Oh, alleluia and hooray! Our Willy Wonka's back today. We thought you'd never make it home. We thought you'd left us all alone. We knew that you would have to face some frightful creatures up in space. We even thought we heard the crunch of someone eating you for lunch." "All right," shouted Mr. Wonka, laughing and raising both hands. "Thank you for your welcome. Will some of you please help to get this bed out of here?" 50 Oompa Loompas ran forward and pushed the bed with the 3 old ones in it out of the elevator. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, both looking completely overwhelmed by it all, followed the bed out. Then came Grandpa Joe, Charlie, and Mr. Wonka. "Now," said Mr. Wonka, addressing Grandpa George, Grandma Georgina, and Grandma Josephine, "up you hop out of that bed and let's get cracking. I'm sure you'll all want to lend a hand running the factory." "Who, us?" said Grandma Josephine. "Yes, you," said Mr. Wonka. "You must be joking," said Grandma Georgina. "I never joke," said Mr. Wonka. "Now, just you listen to me, sir," said old Grandpa George, sitting up straight in bed. "You've got us into quite enough troubles and trumbles for one day." "I've got you out of them too," said Mr. Wonka proudly. "And I'm going to get you out of that bed as well. You see if I don't." That's it for today, everyone. I really hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more read-alongs. See you next time. Bye!